Hey everyone. In this video we're going to go over the PowerPoint on drafting research papers. So we talked about getting started and doing the research. We found our sources. Hopefully we've kept track of them and we know what information we're going to use from each one and how we're going to use it, and we know everything we need to know to do the reference entries and the citations and all that good stuff. Now, though, it's time to actually draft the paper itself. So, review your primary research question or your primary topic, whatever you were searching for, and any of your main points. Think about those. What is your thesis or your working thesis? And what do you anticipate your main points being in the body of the essay? Deepen your thinking about a topic. Think about everything you've learned, what you think about it, how you feel about it. Think about how each source that you plan on using connects to your topic and to your point of view. Think about how each source is different. Just think about how it's all going to work together. Imagine what your paper is going to look like. How do you envision the progression of your ideas going? Your sources might help you figure out how to organize, but it's really more about how you want to present the information to the reader. And make sure you're clear about how your sources are going to fit in to each of those sections. So you want to have an idea of the whole paper before you get started. If you are into outlining, and it would be super helpful if you were, then you might want to create an outline at this point. Now it's still tentative. Just because you create the outline right now does not mean you have to stick to that plan. You can come back and revise it and change things around, but at least it will give you a starting point so that you know what direction to go in and what order to go in. First thing you want to do before you actually start writing, though, at least writing the actual essay, is you want to go back to that working thesis and you want to sharpen it. You want to make sure that it is crystal clear, sharp, focused, ready to go. You want to use richer, clearer terms than what you might have had in the working thesis. Make sure that does your working thesis use vague, broad terms? Replace them with vivid, concrete terms. Qualify it if needed. So instead of making a very strict statement like, implying that something happens all the time, because nothing ever happens all the time except the sun rises and sets. Say something like often, usually, right? You want to use those qualifying terms because making such black and white statements as a thesis turns off a lot of readers. And it's probably not true. It would be very hard for you to actually prove your thesis if you're using very strict terms. If you qualify it, then you stand a better chance of actually convincing the reader to see your point of view. Stress your idea through opposition, right? You can actually deepen your own argument and your own thesis by adding in an opposing point of view. Something like, although many people believe blah, 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 in reality, this is often the case, right? You don't have to do that, but it can really strengthen your thesis statement if you do. But regardless of, linking in opposition, you definitely want to use those rich, vivid, concrete terms, and you want to qualify it if necessary. You want a sharpened thesis statement. All right? So on slide 4, we have an example here. The original working thesis statement said, in Alice Munro's An Ounce of Cure, infatuation messes with the narrator's head, so her life gets turned upside down. That was probably a good place for us to start, so that we had an idea of what direction we wanted to head in with the paper, what kind of sources we wanted to look for. But there's some very informal phrases used, and very broad, vague phrases. What do we mean by infatuation messes with the narrator's head? Not only is that kind of informal for a college level paper, but what does it even mean? Also, her life gets turned upside down. First of all, that's a cliche. We want to avoid cliches whenever possible. Second of all, what does that actually mean? Right? So some questions that we could ask about this working thesis, in what way is the story about infatuation, like we claimed? And if it messes with her head, what kind of trouble comes from that infatuation? How is it messing with her head? What kind of confusion? What kind of, problems? What do you mean by the phrase, that's from the revised. So that's where we want to start, is thinking about those ideas. That will help us clarify. What do we mean by turned upside down? What happened? So let's read the revised version. When Alice Munro's An Ounce of Cure tells a simple story of infatuation leading to confusion and trouble, the story is more importantly about the plots of life, the ways in which the narrator experiences life as a competing set of stories, romance, fairy tales, farce, none of which does justice to the complexity of real life. So that's much better revised. And then continue, making sure that you are hitting on each of those points. Make sure that you understand how the story is about infatuation, how it leads to confusion and trouble, what specifically we mean by confusion and trouble. You need to know these things forward and backwards before including them in your thesis. And you need to make sure that you touch on them in the essay, right? So another way you can sharpen your thesis, I have here on slide 5, is looking at each element of the sentence, right? And you may have seen this example before. Batman's personality is more complex than Superman's. Alright, well, Batman and Superman, that covers a lot of ground. Personality, that covers a lot of ground. More complex, what does that even mean? So it was a good starting point for us, but, that's, our research definitely took us somewhere more focused. So let's go back and refine this. Turns out that, we weren't even interested in Batman and Superman in movies or TV shows or anything like that. We ended up focusing on early editions of comics. So we need to clarify that in the thesis statement. In the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Batman's personality is more complex than Superman's. Okay? But we actually even narrowed our focus even more, because Batman and Superman are who they are in their superhero alter egos, but that's not even what we're talking about in the essay. We were actually talking about their normal everyday life alter egos. So we need to clarify that. In the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Bruce Wayne's personality is more complex than Clark Kent's. Okay, we are so close to being super focused here, but we still have that element of personality being more complex. There are so many facets of a person's personality. What do we mean by more complex? Well, now that we've done the research and we have, a very good understanding of where we're going with this essay, we know what we mean by it. So let's clarify it. In the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Bruce Wayne is more pessimistic than Clark Kent. That's what we ultimately focused on. That is what our thesis statement needs to say. Alright? And then there's some more examples there of some strong thesis statements and how they need to be focused, right? You probably didn't have that at the start. That's why we call it a working thesis. This is the time where you need to come back and focus it, sharpen it up. Make sure it tells the reader in a crystal clear way exactly what you're going to do in the essay. Right? All right. Let's go down to slide 7. So you do have to come up with a full introductory paragraph that includes that sharpened thesis statement, right? We've talked about ways to create good introductory paragraphs. Remember what it's supposed to do. You know, the introductory paragraph is supposed to grab your reader's attention in some way, introduce the general topic, and then provide background information if necessary, and then narrow down the focus, and then reveal your thesis statement. What about the rest of the essay, the middle of the essay? That's the part that has the most work put into it, right? So we want to consider how to organize the body of the essay. One thing you do not want to do is create what we call a high school hamburger, which is the 5-paragraph essay. You have probably had to write these before, and it specifically asked you to write a 5-paragraph essay, right? And that's sort of like your basic essay. You know, you have your introductory paragraph, 3 main points, concluding paragraph. And that is a great way to get comfortable with essay writing. But we are now trying to go beyond that basic level. You don't just want 5 paragraphs. If you have a good topic that you've really researched and you have a lot to say about, you know, and if you have a page guideline of, 4 to 5 pages, that can't just be 5 paragraphs. Otherwise, you're going to have paragraphs that are way too long. And we know that paragraphs need to be unified. There needs to be unity, which means focus. One idea per paragraph, right? So one main point in a high school hamburger gets just 1 paragraph. But going beyond that level, showing more complex thinking and more advanced writing, one main point might take 2, 3, 4 paragraphs to fully develop and work through. You don't just want to regurgitate information. You have to analyze and synthesize it. You're not just presenting data. You are making an argument. You are presenting your own ideas about your topic. You do not just want a series of source summaries, right? You can't just summarize source after source and call that a good research paper. That's not how it works. You want to put your discussion in context, whatever your paper, whatever your topic is, whatever you're saying about your topic. You want to consider where to position your primary sources, if you have any, like your surveys, your observations, your interviews, and where to position your secondary sources. You want to make sure you understand the relationship between your sources and your own ideas. That will help you figure out how to organize your main points and how to use your sources. We often want to put our most important main point last. It's just human nature that we tend to remember what we hear or what we read last. So you want to end with the biggest bang. So you often start with your least impressive main point, or the one that you have the least to say about, and work your way down to like the big main point, the one that's really going to seal the deal. All right. You can consider two different drafting methods. Some people write systematically. They have a detailed outline, including where they're going to put their supporting evidence. They've arranged all their research notes in the precise order of their outline. They write methodically. They have their thesis. They write according to their outline and notes. They cite their sources as they're drafting. They have them, that reference entry already created, so they know exactly what needs to go in the parentheses, and they just go right through it very methodically. Some people do it more freely, right? You look over your thesis and your notes and set them aside. Maybe jot down a brief outline, and then you just start writing. You get all your research-based thinking down without stress, not thinking about the details, not thinking about if it's exactly right. And then you go back to your notes to develop it further, and then to integrate the sources more carefully and add in the citations. I personally think that writing at least a little more systematically saves you time in the end. But if you're one of those people who just needs to start writing and not get interrupted, then maybe writing more freely is what would work better for you, but just anticipate having to go back and refine things and add in your sources in a more professional way and citing them. But just make sure if you write freely, make a note for yourself somehow. Draw attention to any place where you used source information. That way you know to go back to that spot and add the citation in. Because that's another way that you can unintentionally plagiarize, is you knew it was source information. You had every intention of citing it, but you were just trying to get all your thoughts down, trying to get the paragraphs written, and then go back in and add your citations, and you missed one. So you really do have to figure out which way works best for you. I do think that writing at least a little more systematically can help prevent other problems that might arise if you just write freely, especially if you are not comfortable or you're not as experienced with research writing. Right? You want to make sure that you're respecting your sources, and I don't just mean by citing them. That is obviously one thing you have to do with your sources. But in terms of how you use them in the essay, how you present the source information. You want to avoid strings of references. You don't just want reference after source after source after source. You have to discuss each source. You have to make the connection. You have to introduce the information. You have to then follow up and explain why that information relates to your point, how it all fits together, right? You don't want entire paragraphs of source material, whether it's paraphrased or quoted. You want your thinking in there. Otherwise, your thinking is going to disappear. You don't want to overload the paper with very complex information and like dense data and statistics. If you have to include that kind of information, make sure you unpack it and explain it. And really try to resist the urge to copy and paste. Even if you're going to put it in quotes and cite it, it's much better if you figure out how to naturally incorporate it into your own sentences, right? Because if you keep copying and pasting, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with too much source material, and your contribution to the paper won't be enough. You want to make sure that you are engaging with the source material as you draft the essay. Reason with it. That line of reasoning helps the reader understand why you used that source information, how it connects to the point of that paragraph, how it all connects to your thesis, you have to explain. That's what we call reasoning, line of reasoning. And you want to make sure that you don't just start off a paragraph with source material or end with source material. You need a topic sentence at the beginning of every paragraph that makes a point that somehow relates to your thesis and guide us into the source information. Give us the source information in whatever way you've chosen to do that, whether it's summary, paraphrase, or direct quote. And then you reason with the evidence. You show us how it's connected. And then a concluding sentence, all of your own, that is not a source, right? That reiterates, it kind of reemphasizes or reminds us of what that paragraph was about, or it advances the idea that you presented in the topic sentence. You really want to make sure that you are incorporating the source material, not just plopping it in. It's so important. And I have an example here on slide 11, a good example of how to of reasoning with the evidence. So, people claim that the only way for children to gain full emotional and behavioral skills is to be raised by both a mother and a father. When a topic such as this one has a broad amount of variables, it is impossible to simply link these problems to only having one parent. In the article, Single-Parent Families Cause Juvenile Crime, author Robert L. McGinnis states, quote, "Children from single-parent families are more likely to have behavior problems because they tend to lack economic security and adequate time with parents. The simple statement that raw criminals are products of single-parent adolescence is absurd." They're reacting to the source material they just provided, what she just quoted. What this writer must understand is that it can be extremely difficult for one parent to raise a child by themselves for many reasons. A single parent must work full-time to be able to afford to provide for themselves and their child. They must also be able to still have time to offer an exuberant amount of emotional time for the well-being of their child. However, even though this may seem impossible, it can be done. So they didn't just tell us what McGinnis said. They told us what McGinnis said and then related it. They explained it, why it was faulty reasoning, and then how it connects to their point of view. Their point of view is, that was way too simplistic of an explanation. There are a lot of variables, a lot of different factors, and it's really hard. Quit judging. But even beyond that, it can be done. Plenty of people from single-parent homes grow up to be perfectly well-adjusted adults, right? So she reasoned with the evidence. She didn't just plop it in there and move on. She plopped it in there. Actually, she integrated it in there and really tackled it, right? That's what you want to do. When you're using your source material, because if you're told that you have to use a minimum of 3 to 5 sources, that means you got to use at least 3. You want to make sure that you're using it the right way. Now, I don't just mean citing it. I mean using it for the right reasons. Don't just randomly use source information. Make sure that it is for the right reasons, that it's going to deepen and develop the point you're making in that part of the essay, that it's going to support your point and your thinking, that it's going to give credibility to it, that it will bring your point to life, or that it's going to address a counter-argument, like the example we just looked at. Use quotation restraint. Remember, key statements by authorities and experts, those might be things you want to put in direct quotes. Anything that's really well phrased, you might want to do a direct quote. But otherwise, use direct quotes sparingly, rely more on the paraphrases and the summaries. And try to work towards smooth integration. State and explain your own idea so that there's a context there for why you're about to cite this source. Identify and introduce the source, link it to your discussion, summarize, paraphrase, or quote the source, provide the citation, and then use the source. You're not just putting it in there because it's a requirement from the instructor. You're using it because it's supposed to help strengthen that part of your essay. So make sure it does. Use the source, right? Explain it, expand on it, refute it if it's an opposing point of view. But just make sure that it's helping your essay, not just checking off a box for a requirement of the assignment. Use the sources appropriately, but use them effectively also. We're going to look more on how to work on paraphrases instead of direct quotes, as well as how to start learning how to integrate them smoothly so that they don't sound so abrupt. Both of those go hand in hand. If you have any questions about the information in this PowerPoint, let me know.